Kerri Kupec Urbahn, former counselor to Attorney General Bill Barr and Fox News legal editor, is here to help us break this all down and talk about Jack Smith's move at the Supreme Court as well. Let's listen to a little more from Speaker Johnson about why he thought it was necessary to take this to a full vote in the House to authorize an impeachment inquiry. Listen here.
Following the facts where they lead is hitting a stone wall because the White House is impeding that investigation now. They're not allowing witnesses to come forward and thousands of pages of documents. So we have no choice. To fulfill our constitutional responsibility, we have to take the next step. We're not making a political decision. It's not. It's a legal decision.
We are not making a political decision. It's a legal decision. What do you say to his justification?
The standard's pretty high. The Constitution sets forth what crimes someone may be impeached for, and it's treason, bribery, and other high crimes and misdemeanors. So the Speaker is right in terms of being thorough, investigating, and if the White House is in fact impeding their efforts to do so by not producing documents, that does stall things. However, I did think it was interesting what the Speaker said, and this was in the soundbite you played at the top of the segment with Chad, where he said there are expectations on all sides as far as what's going to happen next. And I think we should talk about why there are expectations. And I would argue that it started with Bob Mueller and that case that he brought against Trump, which obviously resulted in nothing and really just perpetrated this Russia collusion hoax that didn't exist. And then, of course, some of these impeachment inquiries and trials of the former president. And I think what Bob Mueller and the Democrats did during the Trump administration was they both lowered the standards of justice, diminished the standards of justice while raising the expectations on both sides. And that created a path towards revenge politics. And I think Speaker Johnson's right in being careful and thorough, because what would be really tragic is if the Republicans start engaging in the same kind of games and abuse, really, of justice that we saw occur in the Trump administration against the former president.
You know, so for all the claims that this is a legal decision, an impeachment is a political process. And where is the bar, as you see it, between an impeachment inquiry and filing articles of impeachment?
Well, there needs to be direct evidence of a crime, and that's something the Attorney General, who I worked for, Bill Barr, and the former administration, when people were confused about, or just even coming to him, this person should go to jail, and this should happen, and this should happen, a clarifying question he would ask us as his senior aides, and he would ask really anyone who came to him, he would say, what is the crime? Yeah. And you need evidence for a crime. And so that's what they're continuing to investigate. But to your point, John, and I think to answer a question that are on a lot of people's minds, if there isn't that concrete, direct evidence, then they need to put it aside and move on.
All right. Speaking of moving on, Jack Smith is trying to move on very quickly with his trial of President Trump for the January 6th uprising. He has gone to the Supreme Court now to ask for a direct opinion, bypassing the appellate court, as to whether or not the former president, as a former president, is immune from prosecution or is not. Smith also says he has got some pretty tantalizing evidence from Donald Trump's White House cell phone that he wants to bring up in court. What do you think about this whole thing that he is going through?
Well, as he and his DOJ team said in their filing, this is an extraordinary request to bypass the appellate court because it's an extraordinary case. One thing he did not add in that is that he and his team are extraordinarily aggressive prosecutors. And, you know, there's a lot of coverage over the so-called wins that Jack Smith and his team have had over the last month or so. What's not covered as much, John, are the losses that he has been experiencing within those so-called wins. For instance, Jack Smith and his team asked for a gag order that would have severely impacted Donald Trump's ability not just to defend himself publicly, but also to speak about his reelect, because they're tied together. Correct. The court narrowed that gag order, saying it was too broad. Then in the civil case, the January civil case, DOJ weighed in on that. This is very recently. And they asked the court there to assume, for the sake of that case, that Donald Trump's speech around January 6th was cause for incitement. They're not bringing the charge of incitement, yet they wanted the court to essentially assume that that was true. And the court said, wait a second, that's not before us. The former president has not appealed that. So and then lastly, I would say that his deputy, Jack Smith's deputy in this case, is a very aggressive prosecutor as well. However, very interesting. In fall 2020, rewinding back a bit, when he was at the Justice Department, he was not aggressive when it came to election interference, and here's why. DOJ has an interesting policy where you cannot investigate allegations of fraud in real time when it's around an election, which on its face strikes people as a little bit strange in terms of common sense. Well, Bill Barr said, wait a second, there are all these allegations of fraud. You should be able to investigate those in real time. He put out a memo directing U.S. attorneys, allowing them to do so. Jack Smith's current deputy wrote a memo to Bill Barr saying this was inserting DOJ into politics. They shouldn't be able to do that. And what do you know? Now they are fast-tracking the timeline to get these cases before the Supreme Court. Why? Because of politics and the 2024 election.
Before an election. Well, Donald Trump may have the opportunity to pardon himself if he is convicted. He's got until the 20th of December to respond. We'll see where this goes. Kerri, great to see you.
Good to see you. Thanks, John.
I'm Steve Ducey.
I'm Brian Kilmeade.
And I'm Ainsley Earhart. And click here to subscribe to the Fox News YouTube page to catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis.